With less than 5 days to go before the 2024 election, where does it all stand? And what's the outlook right now? Right now, nearly 60 million ballots have already been cast. Everyone interested in the presidential election is still trying to figure out where this race stands. Despite so many votes having been cast, it really is hard to know what it all means. Many more people have yet to vote. Exactly how many there will be or how that vote will be split is still unknown. Thanks for joining us. I'm Elliot Francis. You know, no one really knows the answers, but I think my guest can get close. She's an award-winning political consultant, fixer, and strategist who played key roles in a number of different political campaigns. She's also an author and executive producer and host of a new TV series called The Political Fixer. And she's a real big deal on TikTok, too. Say hi, it's Shawna Presley Vercher. Hi, Shawna.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for making the time. We've got less than 5 days before the general election is over. And there are a lot of us that are very anxious. I am too. How anxious are you about the election?
I will say if you had asked me the same question a few weeks ago, it's probably not fit for public air, what my answer would have been. But since then, we've seen things come together, people coming together, numbers coming together, field reports coming together in a way that I used to say I haven't seen this since my work in the 07-08 Obama campaign. But now I'm saying I have never, ever seen this type of organization in a political campaign. So I would say I'm about 90-10 right now. I feel very, very positive.
Okay. And many of us are trying to do that, but there's many factors that are interceding to prevent that. But hopefully we'll be able to get over it. Only 4 more days to go or less than that, depending on when you're seeing this. We've got ballot purging in Virginia. The election board in Georgia, of course, was trying to create new rules. That hopefully is a thing of the past, at least for Georgia. Is this going to have, as far as you know, any effect on the final outcome?
I don't believe it's going to have an impact on the outcome overall. First of all, in Virginia, while it is, I believe firmly that everyone's vote matters. It is a sacred right in this country. So I don't want to sound flippant about what's happening, but in the scheme of things, we are talking about 1,600 votes. So I don't believe it will impact the election. And if you're in Virginia, you can still go and register same day and rectify that. In Georgia, they have lost case after case and attempt after attempt for some tomfoolery. And part of that is because there's brilliant legal teams that are assembling across the country to combat that. They are dealing with dozens and dozens of cases extremely successfully. But part of it also is that this isn't as fun the second time around for a number of people that may have been tempted to jump into the hijinks. You know, it's one thing when it was theoretical and people were caught up with adrenaline and thinking that they could get him in office. Now you have colleagues that have had their careers ruined. You have people in prison. You have fraud charges still pending. And when you have the governor of Georgia, Governor Kemp, refusing to even show up at a rally next to the Republican nominee for president, he's not going to risk prison time for this man. So I think that just the humanization of this is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Early vote counts, and tell me if, because these things change from day to day, early vote counts show slightly more Republicans than Democrats. Is that still true?
It depends on the state. So it's really interesting because we're seeing that in states like Nevada, where you have areas that can be remote, that can be rural even, that you are seeing a surge in more early Republican voters than what they thought. Now, I believe based on the data that these are Republican voters, and so far the data supports this, that they were going to vote on election day. These are not unlikely voters. These are not new voters, but they're taking advantage of the convenience of early voting. But what I find is offsetting that is a couple of things. First, in other states, even that don't give us voting data by party, such as Georgia, there's over 500,000 people that are casting their vote for the very first time. At least a third of them are under the age of 40. That number is going to swing widely to Harris just based on the demographics alone. So that new voting total we're seeing, those independent spreads that we're seeing in certain places like Michigan and Wisconsin, that's going to matter. But the other thing is, this is not a traditional election. I don't think that you can look at it and say Democrats are going to vote for the Democrat and Republicans are going to vote for the Republican. We have seen countless officials come out from the Republican side and endorse her.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you that when we see these vote totals and they come out as slightly more than Republicans and Democrats, I tend not to worry because I'm thinking in that collection of Republicans, there's got to be many more now crossing the line, voting for Harris than there would have been in the last election cycle, based on what we know and what we've seen.
We talk a lot about polls and data, and I try to encourage people to tune a lot of that out. But I like to look deeper into the nerd side of things, which is the crosstabs of the data. But so forgive me as my nerdiness comes through.
That's okay.
But one of the questions that I saw recently that was asked of those Republican voters, where there are certain states that they don't let you do election exit poll publishing right now because it could skew the impact of the election, but they are allowed to publish certain information. And one of those questions was asked of Republican voters, what was one of your primary reasons for casting your ballot, regardless of who you cast it for? And 57% of them said they would just like all of this to be over. I think that also gives us a pretty good indication of where we're headed right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, of course, as you know, and many of our listeners and our listener knows, the Washington Post refused to endorse a candidate. You called it, young lady, with help from a tweet from Robert McCartney, I believe it was, who was, I believe he was a former editor with Washington Post. I don't know. Will this move the needle at all? I know we've got, 250,000 people who've canceled their subscriptions. That's a lot.
Yeah, 10% of their subscription revenue. This is tricky for me because, I'm not a journalist. I'm a pundit and a strategist. And so I have a sincere respect for my colleagues who actually do the hard, sometimes dangerous, and extremely frustrating right now job of being a journalist. So I have respect for the profession, but I will tell you, I've lost a lot of respect for the legacy media outlets, the corporatization of it. And I feel that that's where America is right now. And so I hope when we have this conversation, we can discern between the very talented men and women working for the publications and the business side of it. But I do feel like with that lack of respect, first of all, and secondly, the 24-hour news cycles that just amplify nonsense most of the time. If you want to know how this might impact things, the sincere answer is look at 2016, where almost everyone did endorse Hillary Clinton, and it wasn't enough. I think what really matters right now is not will they move the needle on voters. It's can I trust you when this is all said and done to protect our democracy, report on it, and be a good steward of it, assuming it's still standing, once the dust settles. And I think that's the danger for outlets like Washington Post. And I got to say, my own Tampa Bay Times, extremely disappointing. And I feel like that is going to hurt with layoffs and revenue of good folks that are working there. And I think it's going to drive the divide of young people that don't respect legacy media even further away.
Sure. And I have to agree with you that we have many colleagues that we know in various publications, and with all the downturns that print publication has seen in the past 10 years, we worry about those people on the floor. But from my own personal point of view, if I understand this correctly, and this from the op-ed, Bezos essentially blamed this or characterized it as something to he wanted to retain trust in media. And I actually wrote him back and told him, this isn't where trust in media goes. I don't know if that's a beard or not. Trust in media has to do with the demarcation of media that has disappeared because of the digital world. We don't know where fact or where opinion journalism is. And that's what we need to make clear to the viewer, reader, or listener. And then we got a better chance at trust in news. But this thing,
Well, I'm going to go a little Texan on this, if you'll allow me to, and just break it down a little bit differently, which is, from what you're saying, from an expert perspective, yes, and I 100% agree. But from a more foundational perspective, I think it takes three people to bully. I feel like it's the victim who is being bullied, the person who is perpetrating the bully, and the person standing aside and doing nothing. And we always told our daughter that you are never, ever going to get in trouble for being the one that speaks up and stops bullying. But if I ever find out that you watched it happen, then there's going to be some issues. And I feel like that cowardice concerns me, because this isn't a time to be neutral. You cannot look away when someone is being victimized. And that comes from the social justice advocate of me, right? and so, no, it's not okay to just be like, I don't want to be involved. When people are literally losing their lives based on these policies, that is a cowardice that, frankly, I can't forgive.
Sure. And we'll just have to see how it all shakes down, because it's kind of not that papers haven't done this before. They have. There's a history of papers doing this, going back and forth. But it is an unusual election cycle, so we can expect.
Wouldn't you love to live in precedented times? Maybe we can get back there soon.
I hope so. They're coming. Hey, the polls are absolutely maddening, as you've talked about many times before. But they've been wrong before, as we know. 2020. 2016, certainly, with Hillary Clinton, the unexpected result there. How much attention should we or should we not be paying to the polls?
It's such a good question, and it's such a valid question. And I would reframe it slightly to say that I don't think the polls are wrong. I think the polls being amplified are extremely selective. So I'll give your audience a quick example of that. A lot of times you'll see these polls, and it is likely voters of a very certain demographic that they have kind of cherry picked to show that it's close. These numbers are very small. They have to be. They're churning these polls out very quickly. So a few hundred, maybe a couple of thousand people in a national poll, that's a few per state, just for perspective. So I think when we're looking at national polls, especially when they say likely voters, I would kind of tune those out. But I am seeing some really great polling on, say, congressional races, right? So we're seeing some races that were supposed to be toss-ups in the field that the Democratic challengers are leading by 18, 20 points. That just doesn't hold water when you're saying that it's close nationally. We're seeing polling that says that women are favoring her by 14 to up to 20 point difference, depending on the demographic. That doesn't indicate that, this is going to be close. Now, I'm not saying it won't be close in key races. I'm not saying we're not going to have a long night, possibly week, starting on November 5th. And I'm definitely not saying to take your foot off the gas. But every number that I've seen, I don't see where his new votes come from. And we all need to step back and realize that's what he has to do, is get new voters.
Right. He has not expanded that base at all in months. And
I haven't spoken to people that like to dress up in garbage bags lately, but yes, I don't know how big that demo is. But yeah, I don't think they're coming out of the woodwork.
Was that crazy or not? And one thing I forgot to mention to you as we were talking offline earlier, I've worked also in the media consultant space, and I look at things and I'm thinking, oh, okay, here it comes. And of course, the other day when they tried to take advantage of the whole garbage comment, the gaffe from the gaffe master, Joe Biden, and then he came out with the garbage thing and the safety vest, and I thought to myself, bad optics. What are you doing?
Right. Do optics matter anymore? We're about to find out. There was a time when people would lose their jobs for putting their candidate's name on a dump truck. I think that goes to your overarching point, though, right? Which is the media narrative in this. And one thing that he has always been extremely good at is controlling that narrative and making us talk about now some of the most ridiculous things when some of the most serious things are happening. And that really messes with your mental health. It does. It messes with your sense of reality. And I feel like,
Big time.
we're talking right now about things that we have to laugh to keep from crying, but that coverage arguably stole the coverage from women that passed away again in Texas from complications with their pregnancy. It's taking away from the trans community being terrified. It took away from yet another shooting in Orlando where people died last night. And part of that is because I just feel like we as people can't take up any more trauma. So we need this to be over. And I think that's what anxiety people are feeling. And I'm hopeful that we are going to be able to get into some recovery soon.
I'm hopeful as well. 60 million ballots at this point, at the time that we're recording this, have been cast. I believe about 55% of those are thought to be women. How much, and I'm kind of begs the answer, how much of an impact will women have on this election going forward?
It's interesting to me because we used to talk about the idea of a single issue voter as someone that was kind of a mark, right? Like you could kind of manipulate that. And we saw some of that in the early days that seemed like so long ago, where you'd introduce a constitutional amendment or run a bunch of ads that really tried to emotionally manipulate a single issue voter. I don't believe that's what we're seeing here. What I believe we're seeing are what I call tipping point voters. And what I mean by that is they have had enough. There is an issue that is sacred to them, whether it is women's reproductive health or the protection of the LGBTQ community, gun violence, our democracy, the list goes on and on. What I think is going to happen is that new silent majority does not care about societal norms that tells them they should vote the same as their husbands or fathers, disappointing their social groups or even their churches, being ridiculed online if they post about it. This is something different where you can't stop them from voting. And I think that I wish that it wasn't for such a negative reason, but there is kind of a beauty to see them finally raising their voices.
Yeah. And you talk about the silent majority. It's funny because in a group that we discuss this on a weekly basis, there's one or two people, and I have to agree with them. They talk about a silent majority, and it's kind of all over the map at times, but they've kind of boiled it down to the silent majority that may be out there that have been largely made up of the independents, maybe the Republicans who have crossed over. What are you seeing in the data and what you know from talking to people that supports this silent majority that could come out on November 5th?
So the independent story is going to be one that we're going to be talking about one way or another for weeks, if not months, because there are states that we talk about Republicans versus Democrats. We talk about the Pennsylvania firewall, all these things that we've heard now again and again. But North Carolina has more independently registered voters than they do Democrats. It's a huge number that we're not counting. And then you look at places like Kansas, which had a recent ballot initiative on reproductive health in 2022 and shocked the world that in a special election it was defeated. The ban was defeated 59-41. How does that happen? Because Kansas also has a majority of independently registered over Democratic voters, and their Republican voters are extremely independently minded. One of the things that we have to keep in mind is that this isn't Republican versus everyone else, Democrats, independents. This is MAGA versus everyone else. And there is a huge section of Republican and independent voters that believe that the only way to wrestle their party back is to take it away from MAGA. So an indication on numbers is in Kansas, the independents in that state, which keep in mind, huge numbers, 44-37 Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. And that was at the end of September. So I've got to think that number of undecideds has shifted into place as well. That's a huge shift in Kansas. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying Kansas is going to flip, but I think that people are definitely going to be surprised by other smaller races across the country on election night.
You, in one of your shorts for TikTok, and you have many of them that many of our listeners, I'm sure, and our viewers have seen, You tell a story about an 82-year-old woman who was voting for the very first time because her husband wouldn't let her vote. That was like
Betty.
back in the middle of this month, I believe, in October. We're just learning that there are more like her. Before you get into it, let me show you this ad that just came up recently in the past, week or so that addresses that issue. Take a look at this.
Your turn, honey.
In the one place in America where women still have a right to choose, you can vote any way you want. And no one will ever know.
Did you make the right choice?
Sure did, honey.
Remember, what happens in the booth stays in the booth. Vote Harris Walls. Vote Common Good is responsible for the contents of this ad.
We've really got to get that message on. I mean, we've only got, under 5 days, but it's just really taking hold. How significant is that? And I say that I kind of knowing the answer, but I'm surprised that there are as many women coming forward saying, I've never voted. I've always voted the way that my husband voted, or I've never voted before because my husband told me I live in a state that it doesn't matter. What are we doing here?
Well, it's such a deep and personal topic to me for a lot of reasons, but let me tell you what I'm seeing out there. So months ago, when we were looking at how we could help just personally, then I was getting questions from, moms that I used to know when my daughter was in high school, and a woman that helped us adopt our dog, my hairdresser, like people that are not political by nature saying, what can we do? What can we do? And so my solution to having that conversation was, okay, I can't meet with all of you between now and election day. What if we got together for drinks and I get you all engaged? And so we kind of flippantly called it Cocktails for Kamala. And then I get a call from DC that's like, yeah, we'd like you to do this. And so the National Cocktails for Kamala movement, such that it is, was born. And we made it a safe place for particularly women, though not exclusively at all. We had a lot of particularly LGBTQ groups that came forward, but they wanted to ask questions in a safe space. And the number one question that we got asked was, will my husband know who I voted for? And that was a moment for us. So we started having a lot more of this information that we spread online. We started we have women that they do Post-it notes that say your vote is a secret, and they put them in women's bathrooms. I believe that this type of, I'm going to call it oppression to be PG right now, but I think those types of relationships of control exist everywhere. But we do know that they are extremely prominent in the Deep South. And so to be able to have this conversation of women's empowerment, it is jarring. It is sometimes hard to look at to see how far we still have to go. But I think just as if we're having conversations of discrimination and racism, people that are in the space are like, yeah, we've been knowing that. Yeah. So I think for those of us in the advocacy community, we're like, finally, this is getting oxygen. I think it's very hard and for other people to watch. And
as you expressed in that video, in that short, you know this on a personal level. Do you know?
I do. I was in an abusive relationship when I was much younger, and I was also, getting personal and not at all trying to cast dispersions on anyone's faith, but I was also in a very controlling church that told me that if I left the relationship and that if I went to college that I would be defying the word of God. And I had to sneak away to school and sneak away and get us, use my scholarship to go to Florida State, to go Noles, and run away from my domestic partner who was extremely abusive. It was a very terrifying time. But I never looked at myself as a victim during that time. I was always plotting and scheming like, okay, how are we doing this? That's how I'm wired. That's my stubbornness and tenacity. But I did witness so much while there. I remember standing in a little trailer having dinner with another couple that was way too young to be doing what we were all doing in this domestic situation. And she was crying because she had burned the meal and she was terrified about what was going to come next. Oh. And I just feel like when you're in that darkness and you're surrounded by that darkness, it's very hard to get out. It really, truly is. And so having a campaign of joy, I don't think we understand the power that those glimmers of light are going to have on so many people across the country.
I'm glad you got out of it, and I'm glad you're on this side of it, because you have so much to do. It was a bad time, and you're out of it now.
It was. But you know what? It's, learn the lesson, leave the pain. And that's part of what makes me such a fearless advocate for others now.
Yeah, good for you. One last question. Electoral College, and I mention this because I don't think you've talked about it, but I know you know of it. You know the history. Many people talk about the Electoral College now. I always tell people, for gosh sakes, folks, can we have this conversation on November 6th or 7th or 8th? Because now is not the time to talk about getting rid of the Electoral College. Should we get rid of it, or at least modify it?
Look at you getting me in trouble. Okay, I would like to preface this by saying I am not an official representative of her campaign or the Democratic Party. These are my opinions, but burn it. Burn it to the ground. Burn it. It is rooted in racism. It silences the majority, and we are held hostage to it. And I think that this has become some sort of folksy tradition where we trek to different states, but just like I didn't want Iowa to kick off the Democratic primaries anymore, this is become not cute anymore. Yeah. And I don't love how people feel held hostage to what is happening in different states. We always say that politics is local and that people that are on the ground in their communities know better than everyone else. And then we ignore 90% of the country when it comes to the most important election in our society. Yeah. So I think we have to start doing one voice, one vote. And if people are worried about that, then maybe start earning the respect in the voters across the country.
Absolutely. You heard what she said. Burn it to the ground, for God's sake. Hey, tell me about the new program that you've been working on that just came online, the Political Fixer.
Political Fixer, thank you. We're very excited about it. This is a reality docu-series where I go into different communities as the political fixer, and I try to help them do something that's important to them and their community. And by doing so, I try to help teach America what really happens behind the scenes in different situations, how to do a fundraiser, how to brand, how to get your message there, how to be presentable as a candidate or as someone who's a community leader. And what we're hoping to do is kind of burst through this myth that great leaders are born and not made over time. Similar how American Idol cast open the light that stars, while they are extremely talented, they need encouragement, organization, and experts to get them the rest of the way. And so we're hoping to bring more people to the table to run for office, work in these campaigns, and definitely feel more involved in the process.
All right. Thank you. Shawna Presley Vercher, thank you so very much for your insight and your time. Thank you for joining us here and now.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for the important conversations you're having. I really do appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us. Remember, if you haven't yet voted, be sure and vote by November 5th. It is important that your voice be heard. Till then, remember to like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, then join us right back here next week for another edition of Now. Till then, take care. Peace.